Some people rock and some people roll. Some will make you giggle right down to your soul. So talk to the world and introduce them to you. And look at me now, I'm all Barbara and you. You gotta take a step inside the shoes of another. Get to know your neighbor, get to know one another. So talk to the world and introduce them to you. And look at me now, I'm on Barbara and you.
Good evening. Welcome to the Barbara and You Show. I'm Barbara Foster. I hope you already knew that. And I'm very excited about doing this show this evening. It's been a long time in the planning. And my guest is Sandy Phillips Kirkham. And my lovely guest, see how lovely she is? But before I let Sandy talk, let me explain a few things about her. I've known her since she was about 11 years old. We were members of the same church in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was leader of her youth group when she was a teenager, and we go way back. And I mentioned in my last week when I was telling about this week's show, I mentioned that it might be a more difficult interview for me for several reasons. It's very personal. And Sandy, I've never called you Sandy. Sandy is a victim of clergy sexual abuse. And she is going to speak to us about that, and she speaks nationally about that. She's a volunteer for the Hope of Survivors Ministry, and she does victim support and has done a lot of help and seminar presentations and things like that. She's also been a guest speaker at the Cincinnati Christian University. Twice a year they have her come and speak to young men entering the ministry. She's been a speaker at Council on Child Abuse, and she actually in 2005 she spoke before the Ohio Senate in support of Senate Bill number 17, which in part could have extended the statute of limitations where a victim of child abuse could file a claim against their abuser. So I'm going to begin, rather than asking her questions, I'm going to begin by just asking Sandy to tell you how she opens up when she is making a presentation or speaking in a convention, how she opens up and lets people know what her story is all about. So Sandy, thanks for being here. I know it's not easy for either one of us, but we'll get through this. But yes, just give our viewers a little background.
Well, I do appreciate this opportunity to be here and share my story. I do share my story so that I can give courage to other victims, and it's my hope that by talking about my abuse that I can help bring them some healing and hope toward their own journey of healing. And for those reasons, I choose to change the name of my abuser so that it's not about him, it's about my story and about healing for victims. In 1972, at the age of 16, I was sexually abused by my youth pastor, John Franklin. He was 30 years old, married with 2 children, and at the time I was very active in the church. Shortly after being hired by our church as a youth minister, a young woman from his first church came forward and accused him of sexually inappropriate behavior. When my elders at the time and the senior minister confronted him with this accusation, he didn't deny it. He said that it was true, but he said he was sorry. He asked for forgiveness and promised that he would never do anything like that again. Within a short period of time, I would say 6 months, he was making sexual advances toward me in my home after a youth group meeting. He waited for everyone to be alone, and then he hugged me. He began caressing my face, and he bent down and he kissed me. And I remember how shocked I felt, and I was so confused, I didn't know what to think, but I remember thinking, well, this is my pastor, and he wouldn't do anything he shouldn't be doing. Over time, the kissing led to inappropriate touching to eventually sexual intercourse. And once he crossed that line, he made me to promise never to tell anyone. And he made it very clear that if I were to tell anyone, I would be in trouble, and I would get the church, he would be in trouble, and I would be responsible for what would happen to the church. He also reminded me many times that if I were to talk, who was going to believe me? And I didn't even believe this was happening to me. Then eventually, he started to control every aspect of my life, from the people I could see, the friends I could have, how I was to dress, who I was to date. He controlled every aspect of my life, and I really felt like I was in a black hole with no way out. The abuse continued for 5 years, from the time I was 16 until I was 21. But eventually his actions were discovered, and it was decided by the elders at the time. Now, he had been promoted to senior minister by this time. So the elders decided that they were going to try and keep this information quiet. He was scheduled to move to the next church in about 3 months. So they wanted to get him moved before anybody would find out about what he had done. But people started suspecting things. Things in the church didn't seem right. So people started wondering what was going on, and more people were finding out. Now, during this time, I was told where to sit in church, how I was to act, what I was to say to anyone.
By whom?
By the elders.
Okay.
So the elders were telling me, you got to sit here. If someone asks you a question, here's what you say. I was told not to tell anyone, including my parents. And that was all in an effort to keep as few people as possible from finding out. But that effort failed. So it was determined that on a Sunday morning, he should stand before the congregation and confess. And he basically stood up without giving any details and simply said, I'm a man of God with faults, and I've sinned against God, I've sinned against my wife, and I ask for forgiveness. 2 days after that confession, he told me to meet him in a hotel room, which I did. After being given a going-away party, he was then moved to the next church, where he once again committed sexual misconduct. A short time after his departure, I was called into the church by 2 elders and told that because of my behavior, I was to leave the church. And I was devastated. That church was my whole life. It was my anchor. And now I was being told that I wasn't fit to worship there. He did continue to contact me after he left, but eventually that stopped and it ended. And once it ended, I was so relieved that it was over that I just decided the best way I was going to deal with this was to put it behind me and put it down as far as I could shove it into the deepest part of my heart and soul. And that's what I did for 27 years. I never told anyone. I didn't talk about it. My friends never knew. My husband didn't know. And that worked for about 27 years. I mean, it would surface now and then, and when it did, I just pushed it back down again. But one day, I was driving down south on I-75 by myself, and I came to an exit sign that said Kingsport, Tennessee, and that's the church he had moved to after leaving our church. And I just had this eruption of emotions, and it just all came to the surface, and I couldn't put it back this time. It just wasn't going to go back. So I pulled to the side of the road, and I sat there and sobbed for about 20 minutes. And over the next couple months, I tried to process what was happening. I eventually told a few of my friends, and then I told my husband, and I decided that I needed to confront him, that would be part of my healing. And I followed that in the pattern of Matthew 18:15 through 17. Go to the one who has offended you. So I had a meeting with him. He brought his supervisor and his second wife. I took my husband and a friend, 2 friends, and I told him what I needed to tell him. And one of those things was that I looked right at him and said, you had no right to do what you did to me, and it was wrong. I allowed him some time to speak. He said some things, one of which he'd had an alcoholic father, and that was one of the reasons he behaved the way he did. He also told me that there had been many women over the course of his ministry, but about 10 years earlier, he'd gotten help and was in therapy.
And was diagnosed as a sexual addict?
He had been diagnosed as a sexual addict. That was his reasoning for his behavior. But he still is in ministry at this point. I found him, he was ministering in a church in Arkansas at this point.
And I'm going to kind of stop you there and come back to this during and after the confrontation. But one of your main points was that he shouldn't be in the ministry.
Right. I mean, and we can talk a little bit more about that. I firmly believe that a man who has demonstrated this kind of behavior has lost the privilege of ministry. Mm-hmm. It's not about punishment, it's about safety of the church. And the other thing that concerned me when I went to this meeting with him was that I learned that not one of his elders or the supervisor that was sitting in the room with him really knew anything about his past. And so to me, that was a red flag and a real concern. So we had the meeting, and I said what I needed to say. He said he was sorry, and I told him that I would begin the process of trying to forgive him, and that was the start of my journey to heal from this abuse.
Well, to backtrack a little bit, as I said, this was very personal to me because obviously I knew this man too. Now, this did happen about the time I was moving to New England, but I still went back to visit very often, as you recall. And I don't think anyone can fully comprehend unless you knew someone like this, because he had the most charismatic personality. He knew how to manipulate people, but you didn't realize you were being manipulated. And the church grew under his leadership. But he was now I know he was a con artist, and he totally had mind control over you.
Yes, he did. One of the things he would say to me is that he needed me in his ministry, that this was God's will that we were together. He told me that it was God's will that we were married in God's eyes. And all of those things were to control me and to manipulate me. And also, as the relationship continued, he became violent and hit me. And the sexual behavior became more aggressive and deviant as it went along. He really did control every aspect of my life.
Mm-hmm. And as I said, this was always the transition when I was moving away, and I had been, very close to you as part of the youth group. I was one of the leaders, and you were very important to me. And the one thing that stuck in my mind, I remember you telling me when you were graduating high school that he did not want you to go away to college.
Right.
Now you tell me now it was more like he forbid you to go away to college.
Yes.
But at that time, and even then, I was aware when it came out. I just happened to be there at the service when he made his confession, and then word came out that it was with you. And I even tried to justify it then. This is why I feel so emotional about this whole issue, because I believed him.
Right.
And I thought, well, I could see how he could slip up once. He could fall in love with Sandy. She's adorable. I could see how we all idolized him.
Right.
We all looked up to him. I could see how you could have fallen in love with him. And then many years later, after you had come to the point that you could talk about this, and you got in touch with me and we talked, I knew there wasn't a shadow of a doubt that you were exaggerating or making anything up. I knew this was the truth. And I felt guilty because I had even said to people, well, if they fell in love and this happened, it didn't negate all the good he did in the church. And I was totally wrong.
Right.
Because he fooled everybody.
Right.
He fooled everybody. And then when you told me about after the confession, which he made sound so sincere, 2 days later, he asked you to join him in a hotel room.
Mm-hmm. Yes, he did.
I cannot imagine a young woman like you having to stuff this information, not feel free to talk about it, and then the bitter truth of somebody in the church telling you that you're the one that should leave the church. Nobody reached out and said, this girl probably needs some help. Well, let's get some counseling for her or whatever.
No, and that I've often said, it was probably easier to forgive John Franklin than it was to forgive the church for what they had done, because I do believe my life could have been so much different had they been supportive to me. Now, in defense of the congregation of the church, I don't think anyone really knew those two elders had taken it upon themselves to remove me from the church. And I have some wonderful people there that supported me and still to this day are my friends. And you and I've talked. We have some wonderful memories from that church. And he shouldn't have been the determining factor of what that church was about. And so yes, it was being told that I was not worthy to be in that church was devastating to me.
Of course it was.
Yeah.
And one other thing I want to be sure we don't forget to mention is that we've all heard so much about the Catholic Church and what went on in the Catholic Church, and we're talking about something different, but it's not exclusive to the Catholic Church.
No, not at all. It is widespread in every congregation, in every denomination, in every faith. The ministry that I volunteer with, the Hope of Survivors Ministry, works primarily with women, mostly women, some men, who have been sexually abused within a non-Catholic faith. Yeah.
And tell us a little bit about the group and how it started.
The Hope of Survivors began with Stephen and Samantha Nelson. They experienced clergy sexual abuse at the hands of her pastor when she went to him for marital counseling. And in looking for resources, they couldn't find many, and so they started this ministry. And the main focus is to help victims and to support victims, both men and women. But they also provide educational materials for churches. They provide pastor training. It's a wonderful ministry for those who have been sexually abused as a child or as an adult. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to go to their website.
Okay, we will have more information
Right.
on that. You mentioned it was important, I think, that you mentioned the fact that you do still have many friends that were part of the
Yes,
church,
I
very
do.
active with us back in the 70s
Yes.
when this was all taking place, but we never knew the
Right.
fullness of what was happening. But when you and I first talked about this incident, and you let me know all the facts
Mm-hmm.
behind it, I'm like, well, you must have been in love with him, and he must have loved you. And what did you say?
I said, he didn't love me. This wasn't about love. This was about control and manipulation. I wanted to believe that he cared about me, and he certainly would tell me in the beginning that he cared about me, but in the end, I began to realize this wasn't about love. This was about controlling me. But I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know how to get out of it. And really by the end of the 5 years, I was pretty much beaten down, and I just pretty much accepted this was my life. This will be over when he says it's over, and not until then. So it's never about love. And I will say part of the reason I probably didn't talk about it for so long was that I didn't really want to be an abuse victim. I didn't want to be a victim of sexual abuse. I didn't want that label. So for me, in many ways, I wanted to believe that he did care about me. I wanted to believe that so that I didn't have to say I'd been sexually abused.
Kind of hard to understand.
Right.
And when you are speaking at seminars and retreats or what have you, do you have a question and answer period?
Yes.
And what kind of questions do you get, or what do you hear from the people who are here?
I think the two biggest questions I hear most often are, why do you wait so long to tell? Why do victims wait years to come forward? And that's more common than not. 27 years might sound like a long time to hold something in like that, but that's common. The second question I usually get is, well, don't they deserve a second chance if they changed? God forgives you of your sins, shouldn't we forgive them and give them a second chance? So those are the two questions that I get most often.
And your answers?
The first one to why we wait so long is that we're embarrassed. We feel a tremendous amount of guilt and shame. We see it as our fault. I didn't want anybody to know this about me.
And the abuser plays into that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And believes that, and convinces you that, you're just as much a part of this and it's your fault too. So that's one reason. The second reason is, who's going to believe me? I mean, my story, there's a lot parts to my story I haven't shared that I think, even now I think, that someone really believe he did that, or that's how it happened. So the fear of being believed, and will I be judged? Am I going to be accused? Well, what did you do, and why didn't you do this? And finally, Barbara, I really think for me, those words, don't ever tell, or you'll be in trouble, don't ever tell, or something bad's going to happen, never left me. And the best example I can give of that is when I told my friend, I took 20 minutes. I couldn't get the words out. Every time I went to say I was sexually abused by my youth pastor, I choked on the words. I could not get those words out. And then when I hired the private investigator to find him, I went to his office, and the assistant came out, and she had a piece of paper, and she's filling out the questions, and she asked me my name and address, and then she got to the question, and what's his name? Who are we looking for? And I thought, I can't give her his name. I'm not going to give this stranger I don't know his name. I'll get in trouble. I was nearly 50 years old at this point, and I'm sitting there paralyzed. And if my friend Sue hadn't been sitting next to me, I would have gotten up and left and said, I'm not doing this. I'm afraid of what will happen to me if I do this. And so for me,
a 50-year-old woman, but inside feeling like that 16-year-old girl.
Exactly. And so those words, don't ever tell, it took me months before I felt comfortable saying those words without looking around thinking something bad's going to happen. So that's the reason, I think, for me anyway, victims wait to tell.
Mm-hmm. What was
the second question I get,
couldn't remember.
The second question I get is, why don't we give them second chances?
Oh, second chances, yes.
And really, if you think about what a second chance is, it's a second chance for these men to reoffend. It's a second chance, an opportunity to say, I can try this or do this again.
Oh.
I mean, I believe that, and a man who has committed these kinds of acts has lost the privilege of ministry. He has proven by his own actions that he's not fit to be the shepherd of the sheep. And when my elders and my senior minister at the time decided that John Franklin could continue in ministry even after they were aware of this incident in his first church, what they essentially were doing was looking at you, looking at me, and every woman in that church and saying, we're going to risk your spiritual life, we're going to risk your emotional well-being so that John Franklin can have his job back. And it's really about safety. As I said earlier, it's not about punishment. It's about saying that we're not going to allow this man to have the opportunity to reoffend. And it's not that I believe all men, pastors and priests fall into this category, because they don't. Most priests and pastors are faithful to their calling. And I believe John Franklin deserves all the love and the grace that God gives to all of us. But he deserves it sitting in the third row of that church, not standing in the pulpit on preaching on Sunday morning.
Well, Sandy, how did this horrible event, these years of abuse, affect your spiritual life, your personal spiritual life? Because I know you remained active in the church.
I did during that time, and it was difficult. After the abuse ended, I felt like everything was contaminated by what he did to me and my faith. I never lost my faith in God, but I no longer prayed. I never opened my Bible for those 27 years. Church was difficult for me. I went to church because I wanted my children to have that experience, but I just went through the motions. So the tangibles of my faith, like scripture, prayer, church attendance, were all gone. Every time I walked past a minister's office, I got a knot in my stomach. And it had nothing to do with that pastor. It could have been any church, anywhere, any pastor's office. I got a knot in my stomach. And when I would hear someone pray, I thought about my grocery list, or I thought about what I was going to do the next day. I totally shut down when it came to prayer, scripture reading, and really church attendance. And I think that, for me, is the saddest thing of what was done to me, is that I lost those 27 years of my faith.
Well, and it was such a dichotomy from the girl you were.
Yes.
Because, like I said, you were one of the leaders of the youth in that church. We read Bibles, we did our Bible study, we prayed together,
Right.
and you lost all that.
I did.
But I'm glad to hear you didn't lose your faith in God.
No, I didn't, and I never blamed God. I always had a faith in God. I just couldn't, I felt like with church and prayer, think about this. I would sit in a church on a Sunday morning for 5 years straight and watch a man preach, offer up prayers, knowing that he'd had sex with me the night before.
And a man who preached very good sermons,
Yes.
very believable sermons.
Yes. So the mind can't accept something like that and deal with that without having the ramifications. And I really will say, most victims that I talk to, it's the damage to their faith, that it twists everything you ever thought that you knew was true.
Mm-hmm. And it does go back to the mind control as well as the physical abuse.
Right.
Now, you actually hired a private detective to find him. You didn't know
Yes.
where to find him. This was once you realized, I've got to confront him.
I've got to do something. I've got to figure out how to heal from this, what I need to. I was a mess for about 2 months straight, that I couldn't even function. And so I thought, I need to confront him. And again, I followed in the pattern of Matthew 18:15 through 17. So I did hire a private investigator, and he did find him in a church in Arkansas, ministering. And
now, at this point, had you told your husband yet?
I hired the investigator first, and then after I had determined where I had found him and I was going to make this decision to confront him, I then shared with my husband.
Now, you work with women who've been in the same situations. I commend you for where you are today, and you are not the typical case, because a lot of women this has happened to, it destroys their life. Not that yours wasn't affected, but it destroys their life to the degree that they would not be sitting here talking about their husband and their children and going to church on Sunday morning. You're really more normal than one would think you would be, and I know I can say that to you. And do you see this as you work with other victims?
I do, but as well, I might sit here today seeming that I've come through this without too much damage. It was a good 2 years before I could make peace with this. And the way I healed and the way I was able to come through it I went through a few steps, and the first thing I did was that I had to finally talk about this secret. I had to let this secret out. And so my friends were so supportive and listening to me over and over again. My husband, my sisters, and certainly the Hope of Survivors Ministry was a help to me. So talking about it, I had to keep talking about it. The second thing I did was to not blame myself. I had to let go of the blame and the guilt. Any guilt and any blame belonged to him. I had to stop blaming myself for something I could have done, should have done, did or didn't do. The third thing that I did was to process all of the feelings that I was having. One of the things that I had to understand was that doubting God, questioning the church, sadness, anger, suicidal thoughts, depression, all of those are normal feelings for someone who had been traumatized like I had been, and not only traumatized by sexual abuse, but abuse within the church. And so those were normal feelings that I had, and it created this crisis of faith in my life. And being able to process that was part of my healing. And then finally, the last step, I had to forgive him. I had to find a way to forgive him.
So talking about it was a big part of your getting better.
Absolutely.
So when you talk to victims, do you encourage them to
Yes.
talk about it? And it had, during the time that you couldn't talk about it, that you shoved it down, you must have always had a fear of discovery.
Oh, absolutely. I certainly was afraid, what if my husband ever finds out? And it wasn't that I feared his feelings would change about me, but again, I go back to, once you've been told don't tell anyone, you're going to get in trouble, or they're not going to believe you. I still had that fear. And so, yes, but I have to say, when I got to about 25 years of no one finding out, I'm thinking, I may make it. I may get to the very end and no one's ever going to know this about me.
But then you knew, once that you had
Right.
that, I call it an epiphany, that you had
Right.
that experience,
Right.
that something just triggered, the water flowed or the tears flowed, and you knew you couldn't.
And the thing is, Barbara, and I think this is true for any pain in our lives, if you continually try to stuff it down and hold it in and hide it, all you're doing is recreating that pain over and over again. It doesn't go away. So I encourage victims to also, and this is really what forgiveness is. Well, first, if I can, I'd like to talk about what forgiveness is not. Because for victims, forgiveness is one of the hardest things to have to go through. And it's understandably why. But forgiveness is not about condoning the behavior. These are evil acts and they should be judged as such. It's not about forgetting. Oftentimes we're told, now you need to forgive and move on. You need to forgive and forget. It's not about forgetting, because we will never forget. It's also not about foregoing consequences. There are consequences when men do these things. Removal from ministry is one. There could be civil or legal action. Those are appropriate. And it's finally not about remaining silent. I was told, well, you said you forgave him, so why do you continue to talk about this? And you're only hurting the church by continuing to talk about this. Well, victims are told that a lot. And let me just say, victims speaking out do not hurt the church. These men who committed these acts have hurt the church. So that's what forgiveness is not. And I think understanding what it's not is helpful so that you can move on. So what is forgiveness? It's about letting go. It's about saying, I'm not going to let this person control my life anymore. By holding on to this, I was being trapped with John Franklin for those 27 years.
You said to me, there you were angsting over this all these years, living with this fear of discovery. His life was going on.
Did it matter to him that I was losing sleepless nights? Did it matter to him the days I spent crying over this? Didn't affect him in the least. So it really creates in the victim, you die from the inside out. And you are trapped with that person until you can let go of it. Now, it's not easy. It took me 2 years to finally get to that point. But as long as I was holding on to the past, I couldn't live in the present. I had a wonderful husband, I had 2 great kids, and I couldn't fully embrace that life that I had because I was holding on to John Franklin. And it wasn't my burden to carry. I needed to give it back to God and say, you carry this burden. I needed to tell John Franklin, you take this evil and this dysfunction that I'm carrying around for you, you take it back. That's what forgiveness is. It's allowing yourself to heal.
Now, you told your husband, and then you and your husband together told your children?
Yes.
They were older at
Yes,
this point,
they were college
obviously.
age. They were both in college, and they were both very supportive. Of course, it upset them, anytime you get any information like that about your parent. but both of them were very supportive, and as well as my husband.
And you're saying that any victim, you encourage them to talk about it.
Yes, and I can understand if you don't feel comfortable with a friend or your spouse, find a counselor, but you can't do this alone. And you must talk about it, because again, your abuser is telling you, keep this secret, keep this secret. And it's not your secret to keep.
Well, Cindy, we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back, and I want to hear a little bit more about the actual confrontation and how that felt for you. But we're going to just take a short break. Don't go away. We'll be back soon with a lot more information for you about how to get help as well. We'll be right back. And welcome back. And as I said just before the break, well, first of all, if you happen to tune in late, we're speaking with Sandy Phillips Kirkham about her experiences being victim of clergy sexual abuse and how she has gotten through that and confronted her abuser. And she speaks nationally about this, and we're honored to have her here tonight. Before we go much further, I had said we'd give you some information how people can get help other than what we're telling you tonight. And we do have a couple of books that Sandy recommends, and we're going to put the one up on the screen any minute now. And there we go. Sandy, tell us about this book.
This is a book written by Samantha Nelson, who is a co-founder of Hope of Survivors Ministry. It is a self-help, kind of a biblical guide for victims of clergy sexual abuse.
And where can people get this book?
It will be on their website.
We're going to put the, we're going to have the website.
The website will be up.
Okay, there we go.
Right.
And how did you find out about this book, or that this could be a resource for you?
I was through the Hope of Survivors when I was trying to learn everything I could about clergy sexual abuse. I went on the internet and I read every book I could on clergy sexual abuse so that I could understand the dynamics of it and what he had really done to me. And in that process, I found that book.
I'm amazed, and you and I've talked about this so much, I'm amazed though at the efforts you put into this, because you did study.
I did.
You did study about this. And I'm a little confused about the time frame from when you first found out where he was, and then you, before confronting him, you got more and more information,
right.
And then you had a list of things you wanted him to more or less confess to, admit to, ask your forgiveness
right.
for.
So in March of 2004 is when I had the emotional eruption and had to pull to the side of the road. And then it was in October of that same year that I confronted him. And in between that time, I had spent time trying to read all I could about it. I contacted the Hope of Survivors Ministry. And it was during that period that I formulated what I would say and do during the confrontation.
Well, I mentioned earlier that you're not a typical victim. You're a smart gal, which I always knew. But I mean, you really went about this very strategically because of your healing, and two, your big concern about him still being in the ministry.
Right. The fact that and when my investigator contacted him, one of the things he said was, no one in my church knows about this, and no one knows in this present church, and that concerned him that I would be coming forward, and he didn't want anyone to know. And so one of the things that I told him during the meeting was, that was just a huge red flag for me. And I felt the need to contact his 11 elders, his present 11 elders. So I sent them a letter explaining who I was and why I was concerned that this man remained in ministry.
Mm-hmm. And before I leave the topic of help for people, there's another book that you
Yes.
recommended, and where the first one is kind of a biblical study guide.
Self-help.
This one that we see now, and it's kind of hard to read.
But the title is Nothing Sacred. It's written by Marie Fortune, who has done extensive writings on this book, on the subject, I should say. And then this book is actually a true story of a pastor who had multiple women within his church. And it's a great book for anyone who would just be interested, not only in the topic, but it's a very interesting story of how this pastor was able to maneuver through his church with these many women. And she interviews each of these individual women.
As you were doing your research and reading all of this stuff yourself, did red lights keep going on?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yes, that's like John Franklin.
Yes.
That's...
Yes, and it made me understand that there was a grooming process, that he had chosen me, he had picked me out. This wasn't an accident, this wasn't, oh, he had feelings for me, and it was truly a grooming process that he set me up. I babysat for his family, so it was an easy opportunity for him. But one of the things that, I look back on it, I would babysit for this family. His wife would work evenings, and as soon as she left, he would come home. And instead of taking me home right away, he'd say, can you fix dinner for the kids? Well, of course. Can you get them into bed? Sure. But after they were in bed, he wouldn't take me home right away. He'd want to sit and talk about the church. He would give me books to read. He would ask me how I felt about his sermons. All of these things where I was thinking I was helping the church by sitting here talking to him about these things. He really tapped in to our common interest, the church, and then used that information and used that to get to me and to use it for his own sexual behavior. And I've often said, if that same situation had happened with my 30-year-old neighbor down the street, who was just an average neighbor down the street, and I was babysitting for that family, I have no doubt that I would have gone home to my mother and said, okay, this is weird, but every time I babysit for this family, as soon as the wife leaves, the husband shows up, and instead of taking me home right away, he wants to sit and talk to me all evening. I mean, I wouldn't have any interest in talking to that man. But again, John Franklin tapped in to our common interest, and then he used that for his own sexual behavior.
How did you feel when I would have thought you would have been very nervous and very frightened walking into a room knowing that he was going to be there. You had your husband, you had your friend with you, but how did you feel?
I was petrified. It was probably the hardest thing that I ever had to do. I was petrified. And part of my fear was I would get into that room and I would be that 16-year-old girl all over again. And I also understood, as you pointed out, how charismatic he was, how convincing he could be, and manipulative. And I thought, he's going to try and do that again. He's going to control me again. And that was probably my biggest fear, but it didn't happen.
Well, thankfully it didn't happen. Do you feel that you encourage victims to talk about it? Do you feel it's necessary for victims to confront their abuser?
I don't think it's necessary. I think healing can happen without that. I think if you feel like it's the opportunity that you need. Now, in many cases, because we come forward so many years later, the abuser has passed away or has died. So, and I would also caution, it may be that it would open up deeper wounds and create more pain for some victims. But each victim would have to decide for themselves if that's something they would feel necessary. But the only thing necessary for healing for me was you talk about it, like I said before, you understand what happened, you quit blaming yourself, and then you let go of it. If no matter how, you could confront him, you can do all these other things, but if you don't get to that final stage of saying, I'm done with you, and I'm going to let it go, and that doesn't mean I'm not going to remember it, but I'm not going to let it control my life any longer.
But from what we've talked about here and before, you could not really let go until you not only confronted him, you had a list of things that he had done to you, for you, damaged your life with, and you needed him to say, I'm sorry for this.
I actually had him say that I was wrong when I took your spiritual life and twisted it. I was wrong when I made a confession that I didn't mean. It was wrong of me to allow a church to remove you from that church when it was all my fault. So I had him read this list, and that was very helpful to me. I have to say at the end of the list, he simply said, I don't remember all of this, but I'm sorry. I guess the question is, was he really sorry? And I don't think that he was, because I don't think he got what he did to me.
But you had to let go.
Yeah, exactly.
Had you just gone around thinking, well, he wasn't really sorry,
Right, and
it's not going to help you.
No, and that's the great thing about forgiveness and letting go. It's not dependent upon someone else's reaction. No matter what he said or did, I still had to let go of it and live my life. And I read something one time and I thought it was so poignant. Hatred and revenge, it's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
That's very good.
I mean, and that's how I remember reading that and thinking, that's right. It does him no, it doesn't bother him. And I was dying from the inside out. And as I said, I had a wonderful life. And I wanted to live that life. And I couldn't do that hanging on to his abuse.
So I asked you how you felt when you walked in that room. How did you feel when you walked out of that room?
Probably a little disappointed, because I truly wanted to find a man who was broken, who had said to me, I cannot make up for what I did to you, but whatever you need, I will help you. I will do whatever I can. And I wanted him to articulate to me, I understand that this would have damaged your spiritual life. He didn't get that. He thought the most damage he had done was to take away my teenage years. That's what he said to me. I understand I took away your teenage years. He never, and I'll tell you the other reason I know he didn't get it. After I sent the letter to the elders, he called me at my home. Now this is my abuser calling me at my home, and he's yelling at me. And he says to me, you said you forgave me, so why would you send that letter? You said you would forgive me, so why do you keep talking about this? And then he said, you are trying to emotionally blackmail me. And then he said, very angrily, what is it you want from me? I've given you everything you want. What is it you want from me? And I was holding the phone and I thought, he doesn't get it. And I simply said, I don't really want anything from you. And I hung up the phone.
And that was the last time you ever heard from him?
Yes.
So, yeah, it's like he was still in denial. And he was, from knowing him as I did all those years ago, he was so used to being able to win people over with his charismatic personality, his charm, his southern charm, whatever, that I guess he couldn't let go of that. But he had his wife there hearing all of this. And didn't you even have an instance where one of the other people he abused contacted you years after your situation?
Yes, I did. Yes, she contacted me.
Which means he must have told her your name and given you her information about you.
Right. Yeah, I don't know what his purpose in that was. I can't figure the man out totally, but so yeah, that was part of it.
And then you did another very brave thing, I think a while later, when you actually called his wife.
Yes, his first wife.
Right, his first wife. We didn't mention that she did get a divorce.
Yes.
She left with him to go to the next church.
She did.
But then they ended up getting a divorce.
Right.
So now you have found him, you've confronted him, and you, for some reason, kept feeling you should call Shirley.
I did.
His ex-wife.
I did, and it took me about a year to finally make that phone call. I just felt that I needed to say to her, I'm sorry for the pain that this caused you during this time as well. Not that I was responsible, not that it was my fault, but I just had compassion for her because it wasn't easy for her either. And yet I didn't want to bring this past back up and create more pain in her life, but I just felt I wanted to say that I was sorry. And I didn't know, she could have hung the phone up on me, she could have screamed at me, but she couldn't have been any more loving and gracious than she was. She, said she didn't blame me, and that she certainly appreciated that I was so willing to make that call to her. It was a wonderful conversation. And then I found out that she lived only about 20 minutes from my daughter in Charlotte. So when I would go to visit my daughter, she and I would have lunch or dinner, and we've kept in contact since then.
That's amazing. And that is a true Christian spirit.
Yes.
She was one of the people one of the few people that would realize that you needed help and support too.
Right.
And that you didn't do something evil or.
Right. That the blame and any guilt and shame should belong squarely on John Franklin.
And she knew him. She knew what he was capable of. Mm-hmm. She certainly gave him more than one second chance.
She did, absolutely.
As his wife.
Yeah, she did.
And it's just wonderful that you had the courage to do that, and that you two are friends. And we'll always be friends.
Yes, we will. Yes.
Amazing, totally amazing. this is just kind of an aside. We mentioned that, it's not just the Catholic Church where things happen. And it's not always just women that are victims. I mean, in a heterosexual.
Exactly. I worked with a victim who was abused by a nun. I worked I talked with a victim who was abused by a female pastor in the Methodist Church on a camp retreat. So there are women who will abuse men, and it's not just about men abusing children either. I was 16 at the time, but adult women can be sexually abused and misconduct from a pastor as well. And that usually happens in a counseling situation where she goes to him for marital counseling and he takes advantage of that situation. Any other profession, whether it be a professional counselor or a doctor, therapist, that's against the law when they participate in any kind of sexual behavior with their client. And yet when a pastor does it, we call it an affair. It's not an affair, it's sexual misconduct.
Mm-hmm. And you've come across the various forms of it.
Yes.
You reached your goals. You had your confrontation. You had him read the list of things he should ask your forgiveness for. But now you have another purpose, another calling to help other people.
Yes.
And as any life situation, only somebody who's been through it can really empathize with what it's like.
And I feel like God's given me a voice, that I'm able to do this. And I recognize that not every victim could sit here and have this discussion. So I've just felt the need that when I had the opportunity to speak, that I would do that. And I would share my story and in hopes of really helping others, but also to maybe help in prevention. When you understand what a victim has gone through, then perhaps the church will start to begin to understand that we can't allow these men to continue in ministry. This isn't, the church has no right to put anyone at risk. And that's what they do when they either cover up or they return these men to the ministry. And it's not right.
Well, I began by giving some of your credentials, and when you speak at the Cincinnati Christian University, which used to be Cincinnati Bible Seminary, to young men entering the ministry, what do you have? What's your message to them? To know that they are totally responsible for maintaining the boundaries of their ministry. That regardless of what a woman does when she walks into your office, whether she flirts with you, whether she comes on to you, it is always your responsibility to maintain those boundaries. Because if a woman comes in with those kinds of behavior, she's really telling you, she's really crying for help. She's telling you, I need help. That's not an invitation to go to bed. And so I try to explain to them that it's about boundaries, and it's always their responsibility as the pastor, who's the one in power with the position and all the knowledge, to keep those boundaries. Mm-hmm. And going back to our days in the 70s when we had this vibrant youth group, and we called it YAC, Youth After Church, and we had great meetings, tons of kids turned out, and there were some very strong friendships formed. But then, once word got out that it was you that John Franklin had committed sin with, as he said in his confession, but he didn't give many details.
No.
Just that he had sinned.
Right.
But how, these are young people, their early 20s. How did they treat you? How did you manage to sustain friendships?
Well, again, I was asked to leave the church, so I was removed from those groups of friends, but I made some of the efforts to keep in contact with them, and I don't think a lot of them just knew the details. I think a lot of them felt the same way that you did. It was something that happened, and
they fell in love.
Yeah, and he's now gone, and she's in another church, and no one really talked about it, so it wasn't really discussed. But I had some very good friends that supported me and didn't judge me, and understood kind of probably what was going on. And I can say, I've told you this too, I can remember sitting in church, watching him give his sermon, and I'm looking around, and I'm thinking, these people have no idea who this man is. They have no idea who he is.
But he had so much control over you. I really want to emphasize that, mind control.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very easy for people who haven't experienced a certain situation or haven't ever met anyone like him who was so charming, so, charismatic. I think they could tend to say, well, You
Right.
could have gotten away. You
Right.
could have stopped it. You knew it was wrong. Why did you?
Well,
but he had so much control over
and you
your
have to
mind.
remember, it's also your pastor, and that sends it to another level that you trust him, and he knows you're going to trust him. So once he's made that grooming process of getting you in his home or taking you out to lunch or whatever it is, you're already feeling safe with him. And so when he makes those sexual advances, you're confused already, and especially women who are in a situation of counseling where they're already in an emotional compromise situation. There were a couple times I tried to get out of the relationship. I went to him and I said, I can't do this anymore, I'm overwhelmed with guilt. And he would respond in one of two ways. One, he would become very caring and very loving, telling me he needed me, that we were married in God's eyes. But mostly, he would grab me by my arms, he would get me in his face and scream at me and tell me I wasn't worthy of being loved by anyone else, I was no longer a virgin, that no one else would want me. And I eventually came to believe that. I thought, this is what it is. He's right. I'm not worth being loved again. And I believed he was the only one that could love me. And so yeah, when you talk about mind control, and again, if you repeat that behavior along with some of the violence and his sexual behaviors, it becomes, you almost have to accept it so you can function.
My mind just aches for you, and my heart aches for you. Your family, as you said, they were accepting, they were supportive. They heard news they didn't want to hear, but life went on. Do you ever talk about it in the family anymore, or is it just...
Not just only in what I say that I'm going here or there to speak.
They know you
Yeah,
came here
yes,
for this
right.
purpose.
I mean, it's not something we just, they'll send me a text, good luck or whatever, but it's not something we discuss because, again, I've really let go of it. It's not a need that I need to talk about it all the time.
Well, you lived for 27 years with fear. Fear of discovery, fear of would he contact you. There's so many things that went through your mind.
Right.
I'm sure, would your husband still love you if he knew?
Right.
And I'm so impressed. Bill, if you're watching this, I am so impressed with you. Your husband sounds like a great guy.
He's
I've
a
never
gem.
met him, but he's
a gem.
He's a keeper. He's definitely a keeper. Now that you're on the other side, what do you fear?
I don't think I fear anything.
That's what I wanted to hear.
I really don't.
My girl.
I don't fear anything. I'm happy with where I am. I'm a long way from, my church life is still, I still struggle with church. But my prayer and scripture reading is good. I'm very happy with where I am in my life with this abuse that has occurred in my life. I think the biggest regret, it's not a fear, but my biggest regret is that my children didn't have the kind of mother they needed spiritually. And, because prayer was so difficult, my children never had a bedtime prayer with their mother. And I will always regret that. But I did the best I could with the baggage I was carrying.
Absolutely, and I think oftentimes in life we all do what we think is best at the time, what we're capable of.
Right.
And now you have grandchildren
I do.
you can pray with.
Yes, I do.
And I think, you've made great strides to heal your wounds. The Lord has been with you. And you'll get to the point where you'll enjoy going to church again. You'll get to the point where you can freely
And it is
say
a process.
prayers.
I want victims to understand that, this was a spiritual abuse. In a physical abuse, you wouldn't expect it to heal overnight.
That's true.
And so you need to give yourself time to heal.
Is there a lot of self-talking that goes on in your head?
Oh, yes. All the time.
Like what?
Well, I have to remind myself, why I do this. And I still, look, I don't want to pretend that I don't feel anger at moments, but I don't allow it to stay there very long. It pops into my head. I'll tell you, my anger is anger at the church for rehiring these men. And I feel so much anger when I meet a victim for the first time and she's going through that pain and that suffering that I remember. And I want so much to be able to reach out and help them and to say, you can heal and you can get past the pain. It's possible. It's possible. And I feel for victims when I see them in such pain and suffering that first time that I see them.
Without naming any names, obviously, but can you give me some, for instances, where someone has come up to you at a convention or spoken to you or said...
The most recent, I was in Buffalo, New York for a seminar with a couple other people on behalf of the Hope of Survivors Ministry, and a young woman walked in and she was shaking. She was literally holding the pamphlet that we had handed out and she was shaking. And I remember thinking, I don't know that she's going to make it through this. She probably may not, she may leave halfway through the conference. And she stayed, and she's now making strides to try and get better and to heal. And you know, one of the questions she asked during the conference was, what if you don't believe in God anymore?
And I would think that's common.
It is, because when you're betrayed by a man of God, you feel like you've been betrayed by God.
Yeah.
And you may feel abandoned by God, but he's still there. He is still there, but you do feel that abandonment sometimes. And I thought that was brave of her to ask that question.
And did you have an answer?
My answer to her was, he's still there, but maybe it was your perception of what you expected God to do and be is different now. It should be different than what you expected. And it's going to take time. It'll take time to feel that trust again, because again, the abuse that happens in a church heightens all those feelings of doubting God and questioning yourself. It's a spiritual abuse.
Well, and I said earlier that you're not a typical victim in that you have the intelligence, the resources, the support with some friends, and to go this path to confrontation and your healing. And everybody is not going to have those opportunities.
Right, and that's why this is so sad when it happens to so many victims, because some people will never have the resources. And suicidal rate is very high in clergy sexual abuse victims. And many victims will struggle with relationships, holding down jobs, alcohol, drugs. It is a hideous, evil act that these men commit on innocent victims. And until the church is going to stand up and say no more, we're going to continue to have victims.
But part of it is the victim's self-esteem is so low because of the abuse.
And that is why these men pick out these women and children. They know they're going to be the least resistance.
Well, I'm sorry to report that we're almost out of time. There's a couple things we've saved for the end of the show. Sandy, I can't thank you enough for your willingness to open up and to come all the way from our hometown in Cincinnati up here to share with me, and I really appreciate that, and I admire you greatly.
Thank you, Barbara.
I have asked Sandy to read a poem that she has shared with me that has helped her and given her a lot of comfort. And if you don't mind, would you read that for our audience? We're going to put it on the screen as well.
It's called The Survivor's Psalm. I have been victimized. I was in a fight that was not a fair fight. I did not ask for the fight, and I lost. There is no shame in losing such fights. I have reached the stage of survivor and am no longer a slave of victim status. I look back with sadness rather than hate, and I look forward with hope rather than despair. I may never forget, but I need not constantly remember. I was a victim, and I am a survivor.
And we're so thankful for that. Does that give credit to or is it anonymous?
It looks like it's PTSD Resources.
Oh, okay, because that's very beautiful and very poignant.
Yeah.
And once again, I thank you so much for your willingness to open up and share.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're a beautiful woman.
Thank you.
And she's a dear friend also. Can you tell I'm kind of fond of this girl? But also I thank you for watching our show and appreciate you being with us every week. Next week, my guests are going to be Pam G., who is internet, social media, and using how to use social media in business. She's an expert at all of that. She's helped me tremendously. So I wanted to come on and have her come on the show to share with you as well. And also our dear friend, Pastor Howard Shad, everybody knows Pastor Shad, is going to be here with us next week along with Don Long to give us an update on the mission trip that they recently took to Israel. And of course, they're always fun people to interview. And I thank you again for watching. Remember, we call this show Barbara and You because without you, there is no show. And this is Barbara Foster saying good night. Oh, wait a minute. I want to add one more thing before I say good night. If you have any interest in this, if you missed a part of the show and you want to know more, feel free to contact me. I will put you in touch with the right place, with Sandy, the book, whatever you need. So if you want more information, feel sure to contact me, and there's the website again. And with that, I will say good night and thank you for watching. This is Barbara Foster saying good night and God bless you.